Hey, general music class. This next section goes back and looks at another time period in the transition of Broadway. It talks about blackface and blackface performers and the early advent of jazz and the shift that took place with black musicians becoming more prominent and how that affected Broadway. And then looking at the highest level of Broadway in the 1920s, where the most shows were produced, the most theaters were built, the most people went to Broadway, even more than today. And at the end of this high period, we will talk about the Depression next, which really had a huge effect on Broadway. So there are a lot of great clips in this. Hope you enjoy this section.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, rockabye, your rockabye baby, with a Dixie melody. Mammy mine, your little rolling stone that rolled away. Mammy mine, your little rolling stone is home today. Better stay just to see your smiling face.
The biggest star of the Prohibition era was Al Jolson, a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe who began his career in minstrel shows.
Mammy mine.
He was the self-proclaimed world's greatest entertainer, and his blackface Mammy songs brought audiences to tears.
Rockabye, your rockabye baby, to a Dixie melody.
It's very hard for us to understand blackface today as an institution. It seems so incredibly racist and demeaning and stereotypical. But I think there's another side to it that Jolson represents. For Jolson, I think blackface was never about belittling dark-skinned people. It was about liberating himself. Putting on blackface helped him express a depth, a vulnerability. And that's where his star power came from. Jolson was a really crazy, neurotic man. He was very defensive and very difficult in that kind of prima donna way.
He had become a star, and he defined what it meant to be a star, to act like a star, in such a way that there wasn't much room for anybody else up there but Al.
Al Jolson used to have to turn the faucets on in the sink when other people in his show were getting applause. That's insecurity.
Jolson stopped a show that he was in that wasn't going well and said, "Folks, I can tell you how this ends. How about if I just come out and sing my songs?" And you either took Jolson on his terms or you didn't take him at all.
Al Jolson was very, very conceited about how important he was and how good he was and how much everyone loved him.
I was never a great Jolson fan. I always thought he overacted and overplayed, but the audience was not in agreement with my opinion.
Open up that Golden Gate, California, here I come.
The proudest day of my life was when Shuffle Along opened. At the intermission, all these white people kept saying, "I would like to touch him, the man who wrote the music." At last, I'm a human being. U.B. Blake.
The invention or the creation of jazz by black artists sort of gave this country a language that it was searching for and gave it a rhythmic identity. And so it makes perfect sense that the composers would use this invented language and rhythm for the theater.
A a jazz show like no other arrived on Broadway on May 23, 1921. Produced on a shoestring with borrowed costumes and second-hand sets, Shuffle Along featured a rich, rousing score by Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake.
Ladies and gentlemen, years ago I wrote a tune called I'm Just Wild About Harry.
So this is a great clip. There's a couple of these clips coming along. Eubie Blake, when he recorded this clip, he was 97 years old. He died just before his 100th birthday in 1983. But he was an amazing composer, amazing performer.
I'll play it for you. I'm just wild about Harry. Harry's wild about me. I don't know the words, so I'll play the melody.
James Hubert Blake was born in 1883 and raised in Baltimore by a devoutly religious mother and a hard-drinking father. As a youngster, Eubie first syncopated church hymns on an organ, and at 15 he had a regular job as a pianist in a bawdy house. After World War I, he and vocalist Noble Sissle developed a vaudeville act called the Dixie Duo. When Sissle and Blake joined forces with another vaudeville team, Miller and Lyles, Shuffle Along was born.
Great comedic talent, great songwriting, and they're introducing a kind of romantic quality about black performers that had never before been seen on stage. Forget being seen, hadn't been allowed. There's a ballad that's introduced in the show, Love Will Find a Way.
Love will find a way.
Love will find a way.
First time was a love song in a Negro show.
Isn't that the song that they said that they couldn't afford to have in a Negro show because the Negroes didn't have romance?
Romance, yeah.
I remember that very well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Play
yeah.
the chords.
Oh,
I don't know the verse now.
Well, that's all right.
Just
Sing the
the
chorus
verse,
and I'll try to
okay.
help you here. Oh, good.
Love will find a way.
Oh, I know it will, honey.
Though the skies are gray, love like ours.
Like ours.
With Shuffle Along, and was still unquestionably a certain amount of minstrelsy still going on, but because it was created by black artists and performed by black artists, you saw the real juice, you saw the real spark, not black performers performing white people's vision of black people.
Shuffle Along cracked open Broadway's doors to black talent. And for the first time, the orchestra seating in a Broadway theater included a section reserved for Negro patrons.
So again, this kind of stuff is so hard for us to understand today, but this was the first time that black Americans were allowed to be part of the audience in a theater, albeit in a separate section. It's just hard for us to understand what that lifestyle was like back then.
The unexpected hit inspired a spate of new black musicals, which in turn generated interest in Harlem nightclubs that featured a new generation of black entertainers.
A lot of your top jazz performers, whether it's Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, James P. Johnson, they are playing in Harlem nightclubs. They are also writing songs for Broadway revues and appearing in them.
There was this period in which, you know, everybody was sleeping across borders and boundaries. There was this incredible cross-fertilization, cultural appropriation. It's like in the 20s, everybody had permission to visit each other's lands and see what they were doing.
Broadway's most contagious contribution to the jazz age came from a black show with a white producer, George White. Runnin' Wild brought flapping elbows and bumping knees to the entire country with a dance called the Charleston.
George White liked to think that he invented 1920s dance. He liked to think that he was the guy that said, I've got this great dance here, here it is, the black bottom, the Charleston. So many of the moves that were associated with the 20s. Whether he actually invented these dances, the fact was he put them before the public in a way that same way that you couldn't get a tune out of your head, you couldn't get White's dances out of your feet. That was what he did.
I included this clip. This is a piano roll for player piano, and the way these used to work is this piece of paper would pass over a brass piece of brass that had holes in it that were coupled to each key on the piano, and when there was a hole or a slit, it would allow the air to be sucked through, and it would cause that piano key to play. You'll actually see a piano player piano playing a little bit later in this clip.
George Gershwin's childhood was the perfect preparation for capturing the rhythms of New York's melting pot. Born in Brooklyn in 1898, his parents were Russian immigrants who constantly moved about the city, living in 28 apartments in all. First trained on a piano purchased for his older brother Ira, George quit high school and found a job as a song plugger, demonstrating material on Tin Pan Alley.
He used to make $15 a week at Remix. In vaudeville days, that's where people went to Remix to hear the music, and they'd always say, go to the room that George was in with the upright piano, and he'd play for people who wanted to know how songs would sound.
You have him at the store plugging songs. It's a very American notion that somebody could come in and, like, test drive a car. They want to test drive a song. He got very good at improvising and selling the song. And he developed in his piano style, which became his writing style. He was a composer who wrote very much from what he was able to play.
Here's a clip of one of those player pianos actually playing.
If you see Gershwin's piano rolls played, you can't believe it because there seem to be 20 fingers flying in every direction. And he found in his fingers voicings and jazz sounds.
To move up in the world of Tin Pan Alley, George Gershwin went to see Irving Berlin. He knew, as everybody did, that Irving Berlin could not read music and could only play the piano in one key. And he needed someone who could listen to him play and then write the notes down.
So this is pretty unbelievable when we think about the number of pieces of music that Irving Berlin wrote. He could not read music, and like they said, he only played in one key. And there are a lot of composers throughout history. Probably the most notable and familiar to you would be Paul McCartney of the Beatles. Paul McCartney could not read music, so he would always have someone sit with him while he played the piano and sang the melodies of the songs, and someone else would write them down for Paul so that they had a record of it later on.
To audition for the job, George took one of Irving Berlin's songs, sat down at the piano, and played it dynamically. And Berlin said to George Gershwin, "Don't be my secretary, kid. Go out and write your own songs."
George Gershwin was a rehearsal pianist, accompanist to vaudeville people. He was writing songs for reviews for anyone who would take his songs and perform them.
We saw a Gershwin musical called Tiptoes with a girl named Queenie Smith. It was dazzling. The first musical I ever saw. It was unbelievable.
Sweet and Low Down is an amazing number, and it was visually something that people who saw never forgot. And it had people on the stage with trombones.
Gershwin's music was so infectious that when the cast played their trombones and stomped their feet, the audience stomped along as well. Tiptoes featured lyrics by George's older brother, Ira, who became known as the jeweler because of his ability to set words into musical phrases. Writing in a staccato style punctuated by dots and dashes, one newspaper columnist held sway as the Bard of Broadway, Walter Winchell. He turned the page into a stage.
Commence. You put on the nickel.
I want to talk to Walter Winchell of the Daily Mirror.
Speaking. What's on your alleged mind?
Winchell's nicknames for Broadway celebrated all its various guises. The hardened artery, the big gulch, the grandest canyon, Baloney Boulevard, and most famously, the Big Apple.
It is the Big Apple, the goal of all ambition, the pot of gold at the end of a drab and somewhat colorless rainbow.
The moniker for Broadway soon became a symbol for the entire city.
Mr. Morley. This is Miss Merrill, the feature writer of the United Syndicate. Mr. Hart.
How do you do?
Mr. Rogers.
How do you do? How do you do?
She'd like to do a story with you.
Gentlemen, you're about to be interviewed.
Wait till I fix my tie.
Don't you like being interviewed?
Well, I don't mind, as long as you don't ask us which we write first, the words or the music.
I'm not going to ask you that. I think our readers will be more interested in knowing how you get the idea.
You tell her, Larry. Oh, no, you tell her, Dick.
In 1927, the year Connecticut Yankee opened, the team of Rogers and Hart had 4 shows on Broadway. Dick Rogers was only 25 years old. Larry Hart, 32. They were part of a new generation of songwriters that was busy making Broadway the place to be.
Richard Rogers once described to me opening nights. He and all his colleagues, all the other composers, would go to everybody's opening night. And Gershwin, for example, would come out with a wonderful new rhythm or a syncopation or something, and Rogers would race right home and have to top it. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone read the same newspapers. Everybody read the same columns.
Miss Fanny Bryan. Walter Winchell, famous Broadway columnist.
And once you were accepted on Broadway,
this is amazing, but this is what Broadway used to be like. Now, it's still very crowded, but back in the 1920s, it was just amazing the number of people that were out on the street. And again, you think of the time period we're talking about, there is no television, there is just the beginning of radio, and there are not motion pictures yet. So people went to the theater for all of their entertainment, and so everybody was out at these theaters at the same time.
either as a performer or a writer, or you created a show that was a hit, then you were ready for the whole world.
1927 was a giddy time for Broadway, for Wall Street, and for Main Street, USA. Americans had heroes with nicknames like the Sultan of Swat and Lucky Lindy. Women's skirts were the shortest of the decade. And the world was listening to Broadway tunes on the radio, on phonograph recordings, and in dance halls and nightclubs. Broadway celebrated the reckless exuberance of youth, flappers, fads, and the latest dance craze. The biggest hit that year was Good News, with a score by the trio De Silva, Brown, and Henderson. The first act dance number was known as the Varsity Drag.
Ira and George Gershwin heard from their own mother, "Why can't you write hits like De Silva, Brown, and Henderson?"
They were the stars of that period. Their shows ran longer than anyone else's. It's the optimism of Broadway.
Good News was one of over 50 musicals that opened in 1927, a year in which 8 new Broadway theaters were constructed. In one record night that season, 11 productions opened, and the following night, Showboat premiered at the Ziegfeld. The Broadway musical would never again hit such heights.